In this video, we're going to cover a hip mobility routine. To make this really simple, we're going to think about the hip as in 4 different quadrants, kind of like the 4 points of a compass: north, south, east, and west. So we're going to focus on the front part of the hip, the outer part of the hip, the back part of the hip or the glute area, and the inner part of the hip or the inner thighs, the 4 main areas that we're going to work on. We're going to go over both rolling techniques and stretching techniques in the back. So we're going to sit on the foam roller, bring our knee upwards towards the chest, and roll forwards and backwards. This is a great rolling technique for the glutes in the back. We're going to roll to our side a bit, and this is going to get the side glute. Very similar technique, but just rolling more to our side to get the outer part of that hip. Now we're going to go ahead and hit the inner part of our inner thigh. It's the inside part of the hip. These are the groin or inner thigh muscles. So we're going to use the roller to roll through those muscles. Finally, we're going to get the hip flexor in the front. So a few different ways that we can do mobility for the hip flexor. One, we start by going into a lunge position to stretch the muscle, and then we can take a lacrosse ball and roll through that muscle with the lacrosse ball manually with our hands. This is a really nice technique. We can also take a vibration therapy tool and use that on the front of the hip flexor as well. This is also a really good way to open up this front part of the hip flexor area. Those are the rolling techniques for this hip mobility routine. Next, we're going to go into the stretching components for the hip mobility routine with the same focus of identifying and stretching those 4 different quadrants, 4 parts of the hip. So we're going to start with a glute stretch just like this. We're going to put our knee in a figure 4 type position and sink our hips backwards to stretch that glute in the back. From there, we'll go back to this 4-point position, and then we'll straighten out our leg and our knee straight across to the outside. That's going to stretch the outer part of the hip. Really nice stretch for the glute medius, glute minimus, the outer part of the hip. Next, back to this 4-point position. We're going to bring the leg out to the side like this, Spider-Man type stretch. And we're going to sink our hips a little bit backwards. This is a nice stretch for that inner thigh. Again, hitting these 4 main quadrants in the hip. Last but certainly not least, we're back to our lunge type position in a hip flexor stretch. So this is now stretching that hip flexor muscle in the front. Just an important cue for this hip flexor stretch. We want to make sure that you do not arch your back. If we arch our backs, we put slack in the muscle and we don't get an effective stretch. So keeping a nice flat back or hips tucked underneath you position is much better for getting a good hip flexor stretch. Last but certainly not least, there are 2 rotational stretches that we're going to do around the hip. This is for the back and side of the hip. But I'm going to lay down. And the first stretch is a figure 4 type stretch. This is a really common one. And we're going to press on our knee downwards as we pull up towards the ankle. This gets a nice rotational stretch at the hip. This is part 1 of the rotational stretching. Part 2 is bringing the inner part of your knee down to the floor. So I'm using my heel on my other leg to press my knee downwards. This gets a nice stretch here in the outer and back part of the hip. These are both rotational stretches, very important part of this stretching routine. That is the hip mobility routine.